In this video, I'm going to show you how you can make your background blurry and out of focus. This is a very popular photography technique, and we generally refer to this as a shallow depth of field. Hi, Paul here from Photo Genius. Welcome to my channel where I like to do photography tutorials. I share tips and tricks and do occasional gear reviews as well. So if you love your photography, consider subscribing. Now this video is aimed at beginners, and the goal of this video is to show you how easy it is to blur backgrounds. So you don't need any camera knowledge, you don't need any photography knowledge to take part in this video. I'm going to explain to you how to set up your cameras, also going to talk about the camera modes and share with you 3 essential tips for blurry backgrounds. Now the camera mode we're going to be using for this video is Aperture Priority. So on your camera dial, you want to turn it round to the letter A, unless you've got a Canon camera, and then it's AV. And again, I'm going to explain to you exactly what this means in a few moments. So today I went out into the garden with a Canon and Nikon camera to try and get a nice picture of Boo, our dog. Now this is easier said than done because she's just a puppy. So she's always up for playing and she rarely sits still. And for this reason I got through a lot of dog treats, but I eventually nailed the shot and this is the picture I got. And as you can see, the background is nice and blurry. Once again, it's called a shallow depth of field. Well, I want to show you in this video how I did it. So let's talk about camera modes. Now the mode we're using in this video is Aperture Priority, and really to get more creative control over your camera and be able to really advance your photography, you want to get out of auto. Now the great thing about Aperture Priority is this: we're able to control the aperture, but the camera still helps us out by looking after the shutter speed. So if you like, this is a semi-manual mode. And being able to control the aperture is incredibly important for this video because it's all about controlling depth of field, and aperture plays a big part in this. Now don't worry too much if you don't know what aperture is or what it does. I have made a separate video on it. I would recommend checking it out. I'll put a link up here and also in the description below this video. But if I hold this lens up to the camera, you'll see what the aperture actually is. Hopefully you can see that opening and closing. So that is the aperture. Think of it a bit like the pupil of the eye. The aperture is helping us achieve 2 things. It's able to control how much light passes down the lens into the camera, and it also affects our depth of field, and that's all you need to know for now. So I did say earlier in the video that I wanted to share with you 3 tips for a nice blurry background. Tip number 1 is all about the aperture. Now remember, the aperture is inside of the lens and it's an opening that we can adjust. The larger the aperture is, the more shallow the depth of field or the blurrier the background. The more we close the aperture down, the sharper the background will be. So let me now show you how to change the aperture when you're using Aperture Priority mode. So on this Canon T7, we're going to start by selecting Aperture Priority using the main dial on the top of the camera. AV is Aperture Priority on the Canon camera. Now here's the F number. Now this is our aperture position. The lower the F number, the wider or the larger the aperture. The bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. To adjust the aperture, we just dial with the dial on the top of the camera, and you'll see the aperture changes. Now if we wake the camera up by pressing the shutter button and then turn the dial, you will see that as I change the aperture, which is the F number, the number to the left, which is the shutter speed, is automatically being changed by the camera. Let's now take a look at a Nikon. This is the Nikon D3500. We start by putting the camera into Aperture Priority mode, which of course is A. Here is our aperture. It sits in the middle, currently f5. To the right is our ISO and to the left is our shutter speed. Now once again, Aperture Priority means that we can change this, our aperture, and the camera changes the shutter speed. To change the aperture, you just turn the dial on the back of the camera. As I dial to the right, the F number increases, and you can see the shutter speed is being slowed down automatically by the camera. And if I dial to the left, the aperture opens up, it gets wider. This is a lower F number, and again the camera responds by increasing the shutter speed. And that's how you adjust aperture in Aperture Priority mode. So in order to show you how aperture affects depth of field, what I did earlier today is I took my Nikon D3500 out into the garden to take a picture of our dog Boo. Now what I did is I set the lens to 18mm, which is the widest view, and just as I showed you, I turned the dial on the back of the camera and set the aperture to f3.5 for picture number 1. Then for picture number 2, I turned the dial and adjusted the aperture to f8 for picture number 2. Let's compare the pictures. With the aperture at f8, there isn't any noticeable background blur, but opening the aperture to 3.5 and you can see the background starts to soften. Enlarge the images and put them side by side and it becomes a bit clearer how the wider aperture is really starting to blur the background. So tip 1 was about using the aperture to control depth of field. Tip number 2 is about adjusting the focal length of the lens to affect depth of field. Now, if you don't understand what focal length means, let me just explain it to you. It's actually quite easy. I'm now going to switch to a Canon camera. This lens is a standard kit lens. Chances are you may have a similar lens or maybe the same lens. And this lens has a focal length of 18mm to 55mm. 18mm is the shortest focal length, and that gives us a wide view. When we zoom in, we're adjusting the focal length. 55mm is a longer focal length than 18mm, and that means our view is now a bit narrower, but our subject appears closer. We call this zooming in. So adjusting the focal length is a fancy way of saying zooming in or zooming out with your lens. Now what I want to show you in a moment is how zooming in and adjusting the focal length also impacts our depth of field. So I went back out into the garden, I took another 2 photos of Boo, and I shot one image at the widest focal length, which is 18mm, and then I extended the focal length to 55mm for a second image. And let's have a look at the results. With the lens at 18mm and the aperture wide open, we do get some softness in the background, but clearly once you zoom in, it's much more noticeable. Place the 2 images once again side by side, and the image on the right at 55mm clearly has a nicer blurry background. Now when you're trying this out for yourself, you will find that adjusting the focal length of the lens has an impact on the aperture. You may recall a few moments ago in the video, we opened the aperture to its widest because that gives us a nice blurry background, and that was f3.5. But sadly, with most lenses, including these kit lenses, as you zoom in or adjust or extend the focal length of the lens, f3.5 actually closes down to f5.6. Now with these particular lenses, there's nothing we can actually do about that. There are lenses that have what is called a constant aperture, and that means that the zoom doesn't have an impact on the aperture at all. That's a constant aperture lens. They do tend to be the more professional and more expensive type lenses, but other than that, it's just something we have to live with. But I wanted to just mention this as a side note. So what we've learned here is that extending the focal length of the lens directly affects our depth of field. The longer the focal length, the blurrier the background. So what if we've got a second lens that's even bigger? Well, some of you might be lucky and have a second lens like this telephoto lens. This will fit this Canon camera here. And of course, this is an even longer focal length. Basically, the longer the lens, the blurrier the background. It's not just for sports and shooting wildlife. These are really cool lenses. So I took this lens and this Canon T7 1500D out into the garden to take another picture of Boo, and let me show you the result. Now, this is actually one of my favourite images of the day. A nice photo of Boo. Clearly the background's nice and blurry. This is shot with the Canon T7 and the telephoto lens set to just 100mm. Okay, so it's all coming together for us. We're getting a nice blurry background, and that's because we're following the tips. Tip number 1 was open the aperture up nice and wide. Tip number 2 was zoom in with the lens or extend the focal length. But what about tip number 3? Tip number 3 is actually the easiest of the lot. Bring your camera closer to the subject. The closer you bring your camera to the subject, the more shallow the depth of field or the more blurrier the background will be. So using this Canon T7 1500D, standard kit lens at 55mm and the aperture as wide as the lens will allow, I took another 3 photos of Boo. Let's take a look. Now a reminder here that I'm not using the zoom. The camera settings remain the same. The difference between these images is just that I'm moving closer to Boo, and by the look on her face, I think it's clear she'd had enough of being my model for the day. Now a little bonus tip here is not to get too close with the camera, because every lens has its limits. If you get too close, the lens won't be able to focus. So how close is too close? Well, usually it's marked on the lens. Sometimes it's written around the front of the lens. On this particular Canon lens, it's written just underneath here, and it says macro 0.25 m or meters, 0.8 ft, which is feet, which basically tells me that I can't get any closer than 0.25 meters or 0.8 feet. If I do, this lens won't be able to focus. The word macro here is a bit deceiving. This lens is certainly not a macro lens. It's not ideal for macro, so don't be deceived. If a lens says macro here, it's just telling you that if you get closer than these numbers, the lens won't focus. Now, I do have a couple more really important tips for you. They're coming up in a moment. Before we do that, let's go through our checklist. So for a nice blurry background, tip 1 was open the aperture wide. That is the lowest f number, and that's the reason we're using the aperture priority mode. Tip number 2 is if you've got a zoom lens, zoom in or extend the focal length of the lens. And if you've got a second lens, which is even bigger, try that one as well. And tip number 3, the easiest of the lot, if possible and if practical, try and get closer to the subject. If you're really far away from your subject, chances are, unless you've got a big expensive pro lens, you're not going to get a blurry background. Get really close if you can. So that's the checklist. Now I've got some bonus tips. Now, bonus tip, use this technique not just to blur backgrounds, but also to blur foregrounds as well. I've been talking a lot in this video about blurring backgrounds, but people sometimes don't think about the foreground as well. If you place something in the foreground, you can use it to add almost another layer to your image. It looks really nice. Or you can use it maybe as a way of framing your subject. So all you've got to do is make sure that you focus in the middle of the frame where your subject is, and anything in the foreground will blur just in the same way that the background will. Now, what about those times when you don't actually want the background to be blurry? You want the background to be sharp as well as your subject. Landscape photographers. Landscape photographers don't like blurry backgrounds. They like everything to be nice and sharp. All you got to do is, instead of using the aperture wide, close it down. f8 will be a good start. f11 is the classic aperture setting for landscape photographers generally. So again, experiment. Try shooting a subject with the aperture wide open. Try it closed down to maybe f8, f11, f16. Experiment. That's the way you learn. If you want sharp backgrounds, make the aperture smaller. If you want blurry backgrounds, make the aperture wider. Now, I really couldn't wrap up a video about blurring backgrounds without mentioning briefly prime lenses. A prime lens is a lens that doesn't zoom. It has a fixed focal length. Now, whilst that is a bit strange at first, you soon get used to it. What it lacks in zoom, it more than makes up for in terms of aperture. Now, you'll recall earlier, using the kit lens, our widest aperture is f3.5, but when we zoom in, which is what I recommended, your aperture drops to f5.6. Now, with these prime lenses, the aperture opens up to 1.8. Now, f1.8 is extremely wide, and that's good on two fronts. Number one, it lets more light into the lens, so these lenses perform really well in low light. But number two, and most important considering the subject, the bigger the aperture, the more shallow the depth of field. So you can blur backgrounds almost effortlessly using prime lenses like these. This is the Canon 50mm lens, often called the Nifty 50. This is the Nikon 35mm lens. I'll put details on these in the description below the video in case you want to check them out. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you did, please give us a thumbs up. If you take some photos using the techniques you've learned and you post them to Instagram, make sure you tag Photogenius Brisbane. That way I can see them, and I love seeing your photos. Don't forget you can leave your comments, suggestions and questions down below. And if you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to my channel. I'll see you next time. See ya. Bye.